The Resonance Matrix Volume 2, The Linguistic Somatic Decode Episode 2, Dogmatism. Welcome back to the Resonance Matrix. If you are listening to this, you are stepping once again into a space designed not to persuade you, not to instruct you, and not to replace your thinking, but to help you notice the invisible environments shaping it. In Volume 1, we explored the architecture of influence as something environmental, the field itself. In Volume 2, we step closer. We move from architecture to biology, from structure to execution, from the atmosphere of control to the language that installs it directly into the nervous system. Today we begin examining one of the most stabilizing and quietly powerful forces within human perception. Not a lie, not deception, not overt manipulation, but something far more subtle, the comfort of certainty. Before we explore dogmatism as a word, a mechanism, or a somatic imprint, we begin by acknowledging something deeply human. The mind seeks ground, not metaphorically, but biologically. The human nervous system is designed to reduce uncertainty. It is constantly scanning for patterns that provide stability, continuity, and safety. When the world feels unpredictable, the brain begins searching for structures that can hold experience in place. Frameworks that explain reality clearly enough that we can move through it without constant vigilance. Beliefs often begin as those stabilizing frameworks. They help organize chaos. They help us interpret experience. They help us decide how to act when information is incomplete. There is nothing inherently dangerous about belief. In fact, belief is one of the mind's most elegant survival tools. But there is a moment, often invisible, often gradual, where belief changes function. It stops guiding perception and begins protecting identity. This is the moment we will begin exploring today. Because dogmatism does not begin with ignorance. It does not begin with stubbornness. It does not even begin with ideology. Dogmatism often begins as relief. The relief of finding something that feels certain enough to stand on. The relief of finding language that explains complexity simply. The relief of finding agreement that replaces isolation with belonging. Certainty can feel like safety because, in many ways, it is processed by the nervous system as safety. When we feel certain, the brain reduces predictive load. It stops scanning as intensely for contradiction. It conserves energy. It allows us to act with confidence instead of hesitation. This is why certainty is so compelling. This is why it can quietly become structural. Over time, certain beliefs can begin shifting from being ideas we hold to foundations we stand on. And when a belief becomes a foundation, any challenge to that belief can feel less like intellectual disagreement and more like ground instability. The nervous system does not always distinguish between a threat to our worldview and a threat to our survival continuity. Both can produce similar physiological signals. Both can activate defensive processing. Both can narrow perception in ways that feel protective in the moment. This narrowing rarely feels aggressive from the inside. It feels stabilizing. It feels clarifying. It can even feel morally strengthening. But stability has a shadow. When the ground becomes too solid, it can stop responding to movement. When certainty becomes too rigid, it can stop responding to nuance. And when identity fuses with belief, curiosity can begin to feel dangerous. Dogmatism is not simply rigid thinking. It is the biological hardening of perception around identity-anchored certainty. Like most survival adaptations, it develops gradually, often invisibly, often in environments where stability is rewarded more than inquiry. Throughout this episode, we will not be examining dogmatism as something other people possess. We will be examining it as a perceptual condition that can emerge in any human nervous system, especially in environments where belonging, safety, or identity feels uncertain. This is not an episode about confrontation. It is not about dismantling belief. It is about learning to recognize when belief stops expanding perception and begins quietly compressing it. As always within the resonance matrix, the goal is not to create suspicion. The goal is not to destabilize identity. The goal is to widen awareness, gently enough that perception can remain open while certainty remains visible. Because the most powerful forms of influence rarely remove freedom directly. They reduce the number of possibilities that feel safe enough to explore. Dogmatism is one of the earliest ways that reduction begins. So as we step into this exploration, allow yourself to listen without resistance, without defense, and without pressure to agree or disagree. Simply notice where the idea of certainty feels grounding, and where it may feel quietly restrictive. The moment ground becomes stone, there is a moment in human perception that rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as a declaration. It does not feel like a decision. It often feels like clarity. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, when an idea once held lightly begins to feel heavier, more permanent, more essential to who we are. Most beliefs begin as tools. They help us organize experience. They help us interpret events that feel overwhelming or uncertain. They help us answer questions that would otherwise remain painfully open. In their earliest form, beliefs behave like scaffolding. They provide a temporary structure while the mind learns how to move through complexity. They allow us to step across unfamiliar terrain without needing to fully understand every variable beneath our feet. But scaffolding has a tendency over time to feel dependable, and when something feels dependable long enough, it can begin to feel necessary. Eventually, without noticing, the structure we built to support perception becomes the structure we stand on to define it. This transformation is rarely intellectual. It is physiological. There is a subtle sensation that accompanies it, a settling, a grounding, a feeling that something has finally stopped shifting beneath us. The nervous system interprets this sensation as stability. The predictive brain, constantly searching for patterns that reduce uncertainty, registers the belief as reliable terrain, and reliable terrain is deeply comforting to a system designed to avoid chaos. This is where dogmatism begins its earliest formation, not as aggression, not as enforcement, but as relief, relief from ambiguity, relief from contradiction, relief from the exhausting openness of not knowing. When a belief offers relief, the nervous system begins to reinforce it. Each moment of agreement strengthens the internal sensation of solidity. Each moment of validation warms the body with the subtle chemistry of belonging and confirmation. Over time, the belief does not simply feel true, it feels stabilizing. Stabilization to the nervous system is indistinguishable from safety. There is often a warmth associated with this process, a moral heat, a quiet internal glow that accompanies the feeling of standing on firm ground while the surrounding world appears uncertain or unstable. This warmth can feel like strength, it can feel like clarity, it can feel like alignment with something righteous or self-evident. But warmth has weight. When warmth is reinforced repeatedly around a single perceptual structure, it begins to compress alternative interpretations. The mind, which once explored multiple possibilities, begins to narrow its attention toward preserving the structure that provides stability. Curiosity begins to shift. Instead of expanding outward, it becomes selective, seeking information that reinforces the ground already formed. Contradictions are not necessarily rejected consciously. They simply begin to feel irrelevant, uncomfortable, or subtly threatening to the stability the belief provides. At this stage, the belief is no longer functioning as a guide. It is functioning as terrain, and terrain changes how we move. When standing on open soil, movement is adaptive. The ground responds to pressure. It allows for flexibility, adjustment, and redirection. But when soil hardens into stone, movement becomes constrained. Steps become predetermined, pathways narrow. The environment begins shaping the direction of travel rather than responding to it. Dogmatism is the moment perceptual soil begins hardening into psychological stone. This hardening is rarely abrupt. It occurs through repeated emotional reinforcement, social confirmation, and identity integration. The belief gradually migrates from the mind into the body. It settles into posture, it shapes breathing, it influences the tone of voice. It begins regulating how contradiction is processed before conscious analysis even begins. The individual experiencing this rarely feels restricted. They often feel empowered. Standing on the stone feels strong. It feels elevated above shifting terrain. It offers a vantage point that appears stable, reliable, and defensible. From this position, alternative perspectives can begin to look less like possibilities and more like threats to structural integrity. Because once ground becomes stone, cracking it does not simply change perspective. It destabilizes the entire structure built upon it. This is why dogmatism often carries moral intensity. When belief fuses with identity, defending the belief can feel indistinguishable from defending self-continuity. Disagreement begins to carry emotional temperature. Dialogue begins to carry tension, not because conflict is being sought, but because the nervous system senses the possibility of ground instability. Ground instability to a biological system can feel existential. In environments where belonging is tied to shared belief, this process accelerates. Collective reinforcement acts like repeated forging, heating the perceptual ground until it solidifies collectively. Within such environments, certainty becomes social currency, agreement becomes belonging, and questioning begins to feel like stepping off stable ground into social isolation. From the outside, this transformation can appear like stubbornness or intellectual rigidity. From the inside, it often feels like standing on the only surface that prevents collapse. Dogmatism is therefore not simply a cognitive condition, it is a survival adaptation, a structure built by the nervous system to reduce uncertainty, stabilize identity, and protect continuity in environments where ambiguity feels unsafe. Like all survival adaptations, it becomes most powerful when it is least visible, because once ground feels permanent, few people question the material beneath their feet. As we continue, we will move closer to examining how this hardening process occurs at the level of language, cognition, and physiology. But for now, remain with the sensation of stability itself. Notice how certainty feels. Notice where it settles in the body. Notice how it shapes attention. Because dogmatism does not begin when someone refuses to change their mind. It begins when the mind quietly stops feeling safe enough to move. Etymology and definitions. The language of certainty. How dogma became doctrine before dogmatism became a psychological condition. Before it became a cultural accusation. Before it became shorthand for intellectual rigidity. It was simply a word describing something far more neutral. The word dogma originates from the ancient Greek dogma, meaning a decree, an established opinion, or an accepted belief. In its earliest usage, dogma was not inherently negative. It referred to shared conclusions, statements, or principles accepted by groups as guiding truths. Within early philosophical schools and religious traditions, dogma functioned as a stabilizing framework, offering common reference points that allowed communities to organize values, behaviors, and meaning around a shared orientation. In this original context, dogma served coherence. It created alignment. It offered psychological and social continuity. Societies have always required shared narratives to function collectively. Without some degree of common belief, coordination becomes difficult, and identity becomes fragmented. Dogma, in its earliest form, helped create cognitive maps that allowed individuals to move together through complexity. It offered a sense of direction when the terrain of reality felt unpredictable or overwhelming. Over time, however, the functional role of dogma began to change. Language evolves in response to experience. As systems of belief became increasingly institutionalized within religion, politics, ideology, and cultural identity, dogma gradually shifted from describing shared orientation to describing unquestionable authority. The word began absorbing emotional and behavioral connotations. It moved from guiding interpretation to enforcing interpretation. This linguistic shift reflects a deeper perceptual transformation. Originally, dogma described a belief that people collectively agreed to hold. Later, it began describing beliefs that people were expected to defend, preserve, and protect from contradiction. The transition from shared understanding to protected certainty represents the moment where dogma moves from social coordination into psychological fortification. This is where the word dogmatism emerges. Dogmatism does not simply refer to holding strong beliefs. It refers to the condition in which beliefs become structurally resistant to revision. It describes the tendency to treat interpretations as final truths, often accompanied by emotional or identity investment that discourages exploration of alternative perspectives. Within the resonance matrix framework, dogmatism is not defined by the presence of certainty alone. Certainty can be adaptive. Certainty allows decisions to be made when information is incomplete. It enables coordinated action and provides psychological stability in uncertain environments. Dogmatism emerges when certainty becomes biologically defended. At this point, belief no longer functions as a tool used by perception. Instead, perception becomes regulated by the belief. The belief begins shaping attention, filtering incoming information, and preselecting which interpretations feel acceptable. Contradictory information does not necessarily disappear. It simply begins registering differently, often as discomfort, agitation, or dismissal, before conscious analysis occurs. This transformation can be understood through the linguistic drift of the word itself. Early dogma implied what is accepted. Later dogmatism implies what must remain accepted. The shift from acceptance to preservation is subtle, but it marks the transition from flexible interpretation to structural identity reinforcement. In psychological terms, dogmatism can be described as cognitive rigidity reinforced by emotional and social conditioning, but this definition only captures the surface. Beneath cognitive rigidity lies a deeper neurological process, the conversion of belief into a stability mechanism for identity continuity. Beliefs provide predictive models for reality. The brain constantly attempts to anticipate outcomes by constructing internal maps of cause and effect, social behavior, and environmental structure. When beliefs consistently predict experience successfully, the brain begins strengthening neural pathways associated with those beliefs. Over time, these pathways become efficient, fast, and energetically inexpensive. The belief becomes easier to access, easier to reinforce, and more difficult to replace. Efficiency, however, carries a cost. The more efficient a perceptual pathway becomes, the less flexible it tends to remain. New information must compete against established neural routes that require less metabolic effort to maintain. This is one of the reasons dogmatism often feels subjectively effortless. It is neurologically economical. It reduces uncertainty processing and conserves cognitive resources. Language plays a crucial role in this reinforcement. Dogmatic language often shifts from exploratory structures to declarative structures. Words that invite interpretation gradually become words that close interpretation. Statements replace questions. Certainty replaces curiosity. The rhythm of speech changes. Dogmatic language often carries a cadence of finality, a tone that signals resolution rather than investigation. This cadence acts as a regulatory signal within social environments. Declarative certainty communicates authority, stability, and confidence. Within groups seeking cohesion, such signals can attract alignment and suppress dissent. Over time, language patterns begin reinforcing belief stability not only internally, but collectively. This is how dogmatism becomes both a personal perceptual condition and a social organizing mechanism. It stabilizes identity within the individual while stabilizing cohesion within groups. It provides clarity in environments where ambiguity feels threatening. It offers belonging in environments where identity feels uncertain. And because it satisfies both psychological and social needs simultaneously, dogmatism can become deeply reinforced without ever being consciously chosen. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis and resonance matrix model, dogmatism can therefore be defined as the biological and linguistic hardening of perception around identity-stabilizing certainty, reinforced through social validation and neurological efficiency. This definition is not intended as judgment, it is descriptive. Dogmatism is not inherently malicious. It is an adaptive response to uncertainty, fragmentation, and existential vulnerability. In many contexts, it can provide temporary stability that allows individuals and groups to function cohesively. But like any adaptive structure, it carries limits. When belief becomes structurally resistant to revision, perception begins filtering reality through preservation rather than exploration. Information is evaluated not only for accuracy, but for compatibility with identity. Dialogue becomes less about discovery and more about reinforcement. And over time, the perceptual environment narrows, often without conscious awareness. This narrowing is rarely experienced as a restriction. It is experienced as clarity. It is experienced as conviction. It is often experienced as moral strength. Language plays a final subtle role in maintaining this process. Once dogmatic structures form, language begins protecting them. Words become shields as well as signals. They reinforce certainty, regulate social belonging, and preemptively categorize contradiction as error or threat. In this way, dogmatism becomes self-sustaining. It uses language to preserve the stability that language helped create. As we continue, we will move deeper into the psychological mechanics that allow dogmatism to bypass critical thinking while preserving internal certainty. We will examine how identity, emotion, and neurological threat detection collaborate to maintain belief structures, even when those structures limit perceptual flexibility. Because dogmatism is not simply about what we believe. It is about how belief begins shaping what we are capable of perceiving. The cognitive hook, certainty as survival logic. There is a moment in human cognition where belief stops being an interpretation and becomes a structure. Before this moment, beliefs are flexible. They bend with new information, reshape around experience, and reorganize as reality expands. But when uncertainty begins to feel like danger, the brain initiates a different process entirely. It begins to convert belief into identity. Dogmatism does not begin as stubbornness. It begins as stabilization. The human brain is a prediction engine. Its primary evolutionary task is not to understand reality with perfect accuracy, but to reduce uncertainty enough to allow survival. The brain constantly constructs internal models of the world using memory, cultural information, emotional conditioning, and environmental cues. These models allow us to anticipate what will happen next, determine who is safe, and decide how to behave in complex social environments. Uncertainty is metabolically expensive. Ambiguity requires sustained neural computation. Predictive instability forces the brain into continuous recalibration. When ambiguity remains unresolved, the brain experiences it as a form of existential drift, a state where the boundaries between self, environment, and social belonging become unclear. Under these conditions, the brain shifts its priority away from exploration and towards stabilization. Certainty becomes a survival tool. Identity loss aversion. The brain protects the self through belief. We, as beings, do not attach to beliefs purely because they are logical. They attach because beliefs anchor identity. Once a belief becomes integrated into the self-concept, challenging that belief activates neural networks associated with threat detection. Research in cognitive neuroscience has shown that when deeply held ideological or moral beliefs are questioned, the amygdala and anterior insula increase activity, while regions associated with open analytical reasoning, particularly the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, often decrease activity. The brain does not experience a belief challenge as an informational debate. It experiences it as identity destabilization. This is known as identity loss aversion. Loss aversion, first described within behavioral economics, demonstrates that the brain registers loss as significantly more threatening than equivalent gain. When applied to identity, loss aversion becomes even more powerful. A belief that anchors identity is processed as part of the organism's survival architecture. If that belief collapses, the brain anticipates psychological disintegration and social displacement simultaneously. The body interprets belief collapse as loss of group belonging, the loss of self-continuity, the loss of predictive coherence. Under these conditions, defensive cognition emerges automatically. The brain does not choose dogmatism as an intellectual strategy. It selects dogmatism as a regulatory mechanism. Belief becomes armor because identity requires containment. Moral heat mechanism, emotional energy solidifies belief. Beliefs rarely harden in emotionally neutral environments. They solidify under emotional intensification. When beliefs become linked to moral narratives, right versus wrong, good versus evil, loyalty versus betrayal, they recruit additional neural circuitry, particularly within the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and limbic system. These regions integrate emotional salience with moral judgment, creating a powerful reinforcement loop between belief and effect. This is the moral heat mechanism. Emotion acts as thermal energy within cognition. The stronger the emotional charge attached to a belief, the more rigid that belief becomes. Emotional intensity reduces cognitive flexibility by increasing the brain's reliance on rapid pattern recognition rather than reflective reasoning. Under emotional activation, nuance becomes metabolically inefficient. Binary thinking becomes faster, simpler, and neurologically stabilizing. From a somatic perspective, moral heat often manifests as chest constriction, increased vocal firmness, reduced breathing variability, and heightened facial rigidity. These bodily signals reinforce internal certainty. The organism experiences the sensation of clarity even when informational complexity is being reduced. Certainty feels calm, not because it resolves truth, but because it resolves physiological agitation. Binary compression. The brain simplifies complexity under threat. Human cognition is capable of extraordinary nuance. However, nuance requires tolerance for ambiguity. When ambiguity exceeds the brain's regulatory capacity, cognition compresses. Binary compression is the neurological process by which complex conceptual landscapes are reduced into oppositional categories: right or wrong, safe or dangerous, loyal or disloyal, true or false. This compression is driven by the brain's threat detection architecture. Simpler maps require fewer computational resources and allow faster decision-making under stress. Binary compression activates networks involving the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors conflict, and the basal ganglia, which support habitual response patterns. Once binary categorization begins, new information is filtered through pre-existing categories rather than evaluated independently. The individual experiences this as clarity. But clarity achieved through compression narrows perceptual corridors. The world becomes easier to navigate, but only because alternative interpretations are neurologically excluded. Dogmatism feels like precision because it eliminates the destabilizing weight of multiple possibilities. Predictive brain stability, certainty as neurological gravity. The predictive brain continuously generates expectations about future events and adjusts those expectations when prediction errors occur. When prediction errors accumulate, when reality repeatedly contradicts internal models, the brain faces two choices. 1. Update the model. 2. Reject the contradictory information. Updating models requires energy, vulnerability, and identity reorganization. Rejecting contradictory information preserves coherence. Dogmatism emerges when the brain chooses coherence over accuracy. This is not irrational in evolutionary terms. Coherence preserves group identity, reduces internal conflict, and maintains behavioral stability. Neurologically, stable predictive models reduce activity within error detection circuits and produce a sensation of certainty that the organism interprets as safety. Certainty becomes gravitational. Information that aligns with the belief structure is drawn inward and amplified. Information that contradicts it is repelled or reframed. The individual experiences themselves as standing firmly on truth. In reality, they are standing inside a neurologically stabilized predictive loop. Social reinforcement loop. Certainty amplifies belonging. Beliefs do not stabilize in isolation. They stabilize through social mirroring. When individuals express strong certainty, they often receive reinforcement through validation from in-group members, increased status within ideological communities, and predictable relational alignment. This activates dopaminergic reward pathways, strengthening the emotional association between certainty and belonging. Over time, the nervous system begins to pair cognitive rigidity with social safety. The body and brain learns certainty equals inclusion, flexibility equals isolation. Under these conditions, dogmatism becomes socially adaptive even when it reduces perceptual accuracy. The body begins to anticipate belonging when certainty is expressed. Vocal tone firms, posture stabilizes, eye contact becomes unwavering. These signals are not merely communicative, They are somatic declarations of ideological solidity. Oscillating autonomic cycle certainty as regulation. Dogmatic cognition is often sustained through an oscillating autonomic cycle between sympathetic activation and parasympathetic relief. When beliefs are challenged, sympathetic activation increases, heart rate accelerates, breathing shortens, muscular tension increases, and emotional intensity rises. When the individual reasserts certainty, parasympathetic regulation follows. Breath deepens, posture stabilizes, vocal cadence slows, subjective calm returns. The body learns that certainty resolves physiological threat. Each cycle reinforces the association between rigid belief and internal stability. Over time, this oscillation conditions the body and brain to seek conflict resolution through ideological hardening rather than relational or cognitive integration. The steel formation of belief within the architecture of the nervous system. Belief can transform from fluid structure into hardened identity in the same way molten metal becomes steel. Heat, emotional charge increases malleability initially. Pressure, social reinforcement shapes the structure. Cooling, certainty stabilization locks the form into rigidity. Once hardened, belief resists deformation. Attempts to reshape it often require reintroducing destabilizing heat, which the nervous system interprets as a threat. Thus, the more reinforced a belief becomes, the more fiercely it defends itself. Dogmatism is not the absence of intelligence. It is the biological hardening of identity around cognitive structure. The narrow corridor of perception. As certainty solidifies, perception narrows. The individual begins to see reality through increasingly defined corridors where alternative interpretations become difficult to access. This narrowing is not conscious censorship. It is neural prioritization. Attention networks become tuned toward confirming signals. Contradictory information triggers discomfort or dismissal before reaching reflective cognition. Over time, the individual experiences their worldview as self-evident. From within the corridor, certainty feels like clarity. From the outside, clarity looks like confinement. Dogmatism does not arise because humans resist truth. It arises because the nervous system seeks stability in environments where uncertainty threatens identity, belonging, and coherence simultaneously. Certainty offers containment. Containment offers calm. Calm feels like safety, and safety for the biological organism often outranks accuracy. If certainty stabilizes identity through cognition, it must also anchor itself within the body. Belief cannot remain purely conceptual if it is to sustain behavioral and relational consistency. The nervous system must encode certainty into posture, breathing, vocal structure, and muscular patterning. Dogmatism, therefore, does not live only in thought. It lives within our bodies. The next section will move from cognitive stabilization into physiological embodiment, mapping how certainty reshapes the somatic landscape and how the body begins to carry belief as structural tension, behavioral rhythm, and relational stance. Because once belief solidifies in the mind, the body learns to hold it in muscle, breath, and bone. What the body holds, the body and brain experience as truth, the somatic blueprint. The body that locks around certainty belief does not remain inside the mind. For belief to maintain stability across time, it must migrate from cognition into physiology. Thought alone cannot sustain behavioral consistency or relational predictability. The body and brain require structural reinforcement. The nervous system, therefore, encodes belief into muscular tone, breathing rhythm, vocal structure, and postural organization. Dogmatism becomes durable only when certainty is carried by the body. The transition from cognitive certainty to somatic locking is not symbolic. It is neurophysiological. Once the brain selects certainty as a stabilizing strategy, the autonomic nervous system begins coordinating the body around the maintenance of that certainty. The body and brain reorganizes itself to support perceptual rigidity and behavioral predictability. Belief becomes posture. Conviction becomes a breath pattern. Certainty becomes muscular architecture. The muscular architecture of certainty, when individuals hold rigid ideological or moral positions. Subtle but measurable changes often appear in muscular patterning. Chronic contraction begins forming in regions associated with defensive orientation and communicative dominance. These include the jaw, sternocleidomastoid muscles of the neck, the diaphragm, and the upper thoracic spine. The jaw frequently tightens first. The masseter and temporalis muscles activate reflexively when individuals prepare to defend their identity. Jaw tension is not merely an emotional byproduct. It stabilizes speech cadence and reduces vocal variability. Reduced variability in vocal tone increases the perceived authority of speech, reinforcing internal and external perceptions of certainty. Simultaneously, neck musculature stiffens. The head becomes held in a more fixed orientation, limiting micro-adjustments that normally accompany curiosity or receptivity. This rigidity subtly reduces the individual's ability to visually and socially track nuance in conversation. The body begins to favor forward-facing, declarative engagement over adaptive listening. The thoracic spine often elevates slightly, creating an expanded chest posture that mimics confidence and moral firmness. Yet this expansion frequently coexists with diaphragmatic restriction, producing shallow upper chest breathing. This breathing pattern sustains sympathetic readiness while preserving the subjective sensation of composure. Certainty does not relax the body and brain. It organizes tension into predictable alignment. Breath as ideological regulator. Breathing is one of the most sensitive indicators of cognitive and emotional state. Flexible belief systems correlate with high respiratory variability, allowing breath to adjust dynamically to conversational and environmental stimuli. Dogmatic certainty reduces respiratory adaptability. Individuals operating from rigid belief structures often exhibit reduced breath amplitude and slower variability cycles. The diaphragm becomes partially immobilized, restricting the depth of inhalation and limiting the parasympathetic oscillations associated with openness and reflection. From a neurophysiological perspective, diaphragmatic restriction maintains moderate sympathetic tone. This tone supports alertness and readiness to defend identity while preventing full physiological relaxation that might allow cognitive flexibility to re-emerge. Breath becomes an internal metronome maintaining ideological rhythm. Each restricted inhalation reinforces vigilance. Each controlled exhalation reinforces composure. The organism learns to regulate uncertainty by stabilizing respiration. Certainty becomes a breathing strategy. The vocal column of dogmatic speech language is not transmitted only through words. It is carried through vocal resonance, cadence, and tonal stability. Dogmatic speech often reveals itself through the vocal column, the integrated pathway connecting breath, laryngeal tension, and cranial resonance. As certainty hardens, vocal tone frequently narrows into a reduced frequency range. Variability decreases. The voice becomes flatter in melodic contour but firmer in amplitude. Reduced tonal variability communicates authority and conviction, both to listeners and to the speaker's own nervous system. Laryngeal musculature stiffens to maintain consistent vocal projection. This tension stabilizes speech but reduces emotional nuance. The voice begins to prioritize clarity of assertion over relational attunement. Subtle shifts in pitch that normally signal empathy or curiosity become less frequent. From a somatic linguistic perspective, the body begins using vocal structure to reinforce ideological containment. Speech patterns mirror muscular rigidity. Language becomes structurally aligned with certainty, reducing the possibility of self-reflective interruption. Dogma speaks through tone before it speaks through language. Postural containment and perceptual narrowing posture plays a crucial role in maintaining cognitive rigidity. The body's vertical axis, head, spine, and pelvis, act as a physical representation of identity alignment. When beliefs become hardened, individuals often display increased axial rigidity. Micromovements decrease. Gestural range narrows. The body orients towards stillness rather than fluid interaction. Postural containment serves several neurological functions. It reduces proprioceptive variability, allowing the brain to maintain consistent internal mapping of body position. Stable body mapping reduces prediction error within sensoromotor networks, reinforcing the sensation of internal certainty. Additionally, postural rigidity limits environmental scanning. Flexible posture encourages peripheral awareness and social attunement. Rigid posture narrows attentional focus, reducing the cognitive load of processing conflicting perspectives. The individual experiences heightened clarity because sensory complexity has been neurologically filtered. Certainty becomes embodied through stillness. Facial expression and emotional compression. Facial musculature provides another key window into somatic dogmatism. The corrugator supercilii, orbicularis oris, and zygomatic muscles regulate emotional expression and social feedback. In dogmatic states, facial microexpression often reduces in variability. Eyebrow movement becomes minimal. Lip compression increases. Smiles, when present, become symmetrical and socially performative rather than spontaneously responsive. Reduced facial variability limits social mirroring. Humans rely heavily on microexpressions to regulate emotional synchrony during interaction. When facial signaling becomes rigid, relational attunement decreases. The dogmatic individual may appear composed and authoritative while simultaneously reducing opportunities for mutual emotional calibration. This reduction reinforces ideological stability. Without reciprocal emotional mirroring, alternative viewpoints are less likely to be somatically integrated. The face becomes a mask of conviction, stabilizing both self-perception and social perception. Interoceptive gating, feeling less to believe more. Dogmatic certainty often correlates with altered interoceptive processing. Interoception refers to the brain's ability to perceive internal bodily signals, such as heartbeat, visceral sensation, and emotional arousal. Flexible cognition requires accurate interoceptive feedback because internal signals help the organism evaluate uncertainty and adapt behavior. When belief hardens, the brain may reduce interoceptive sensitivity through top-down regulatory gating. The anterior insula, responsible for integrating bodily sensation with emotional awareness, may decrease responsiveness to conflicting internal signals. This reduction prevents destabilizing somatic information from reaching conscious awareness. The individual feels emotionally steady, yet this steadiness is sometimes maintained by reducing internal sensory complexity rather than resolving it. The body and the brain trade depth of feeling for stability of identity. Certainty becomes a filter applied to sensation itself. Autonomic synchronization and behavioral rhythm. The autonomic nervous system begins synchronizing behavioral rhythms to support ideological stability. Movement patterns become predictable. Gestures align with declarative speech. Conversational pacing becomes controlled and structured. These rhythms reduce spontaneity, but increase perceived authority and coherence. Predictable behavioral rhythm reassures both the individual and their social environment. Others begin responding to the dogmatic individual as a source of stability, reinforcing the behavior through relational feedback loops. The body learns that maintaining consistent movement and speech patterns strengthens social position within ideological communities. Behavior becomes choreography for belief. The steel skin of identity symbolically and somatically, dogmatic embodiment resembles the formation of armor. Muscular contraction creates protective layers around the thoracic cavity and cervical spine, regions associated with vulnerability and communicative sensitivity. The body constructs a steel skin, a protective somatic exoskeleton stabilizing identity against destabilizing information. This armor is adaptive. It allows individuals to function within high-conflict ideological environments without constant emotional injury. However, armor reduces sensory permeability. Signals from the external world must penetrate muscular and autonomic barriers before reaching reflective cognition. Over time, armor becomes indistinguishable from identity. The individual experiences their rigidity as authenticity. Softening begins to feel like a betrayal of self rather than an expansion of perception. The corridor between thought and the body. By the time dogmatism becomes behaviorally visible, the corridor between thought and tissue has already been reinforced repeatedly. Belief no longer requires conscious defense. The body defends it automatically through posture, tone, and physiological rhythm. Attempts to challenge dogmatic beliefs often fail because they target cognition while ignoring somatic infrastructure. Information collides with armor rather than engaging perception. The organism experiences external challenge and physical intrusion rather than conceptual disagreement. To understand dogmatism, one must understand this corridor. Belief survives because the body holds it, the nervous system maintains it, and the organism experiences somatic stability as truth. Transition toward behavioral manifestation. Once certainty is embedded within muscular architecture, respiratory rhythm, vocal structure, and autonomic pacing, it begins shaping observable behavior. Interaction patterns, conversational strategies, and relational dynamics all begin expressing the underlying somatic blueprint. The next section will move from internal embodiment to external demonstration. We will examine real-world environments where dogmatic embodiment influences group behavior, social authority, and relational control. It will explore how environmental grooming reinforces somatic certainty and how collective systems sustain individual rigidity. Because when belief hardens in the body, behavior becomes predictable, and predictable behavior becomes cultural structure. Dogmatism stops being personal at that point. It becomes environmental, and environments built on certainty rarely recognize how deeply they are shaping the bodies within them. Dogmatism rarely develops in isolation. While cognitive and somatic processes construct the internal architecture of certainty, external environments provide the scaffolding that reinforces and stabilizes it. Individuals do not simply generate rigid belief structures from within. They are often shaped, calibrated, and reinforced by social systems that reward certainty and discourage perceptual flexibility. Environmental grooming describes the subtle and cumulative ways institutions, communities, and relational ecosystems condition individuals toward ideological stability. It is rarely explicit, it is rarely malicious. It is often invisible to those participating in it. Yet its effects are profound. When environments repeatedly reward conviction and penalize ambiguity, certainty becomes both socially adaptive and biologically reinforced. The architecture of groomed certainty consider environments organized around performance, moral authority, or collective identity preservation. These systems often rely on predictable behavioral outputs. Predictability allows institutions to function efficiently, maintain hierarchy, and minimize conflict. Within these systems, individuals quickly learn that clarity, decisiveness, and unwavering belief are rewarded with social approval, professional advancement, or emotional belonging. Conversely, hesitation, questioning, or nuance may be interpreted as instability, disloyalty, or weakness. This creates a reinforcement loop where ideological certainty becomes synonymous with competence. The nervous system adapts rapidly to this loop. Dopaminergic reward pathways strengthen when individuals receive validation for expressing confident, definitive viewpoints. Over time, behavioral patterns aligning with certainty become habitual, while exploratory cognition becomes physiologically uncomfortable. Certainty is not only encouraged, but it is also conditioned. Linguistic grooming language that narrows perception. Environmental grooming often begins with linguistic framing. Certain phrases become cultural anchors that subtly shape acceptable cognitive boundaries. Statements such as, "We already know what works. This is simply the correct way to approach it." Questioning this creates unnecessary instability. "We must remain aligned." These statements rarely appear coercive. They appear pragmatic, responsible, and stabilizing. Yet linguistically, they perform perceptual narrowing. They reduce conceptual variability by presenting certainty as both rational and morally responsible. Over time, individuals begin internalizing these linguistic cues. Their internal dialogue adopts similar phrasing. Self-reflection becomes guided by the same certainty structures imposed by the environment. Language becomes the first grooming tool because language regulates both thought and somatic response. Firm, declarative language produces predictable autonomic reactions. It reinforces the bodily architecture described in Section 5, synchronizing speech, breath, and posture around conviction. The environment teaches the body how certainty should sound. Social mirroring and behavioral calibration. We as beings regulate ourselves through social mirroring. We unconsciously adjust posture, tone, facial expression, and conversational pacing to align with dominant group dynamics. In certainty-driven environments, these mirroring processes become amplified. Individuals entering such systems often begin with flexible behavioral patterns. Over time, they notice that colleagues or group members who speak with unwavering authority receive more attention, more respect, and more perceived credibility. These observations activate mirror neuron systems that facilitate behavioral imitation. Gradually, the individual begins reducing tonal variability, increasing declarative speech, adopting rigid postural alignment, and minimizing exploratory questioning. These adaptations occur below conscious awareness. The nervous system learns to associate certainty with social inclusion. Flexibility begins to feel socially risky. Belonging becomes synchronized with ideological posture. The role of authority structures hierarchical environments intensify grooming dynamics. When authority figures model rigid certainty, their behavioral patterns become templates for organizational survival. Subordinates learn that alignment with authority not only ensures safety, but also provides pathways for advancement. Authority figures often do not recognize their influence. They may genuinely believe they are modeling clarity and leadership. Yet their somatic and linguistic patterns shape the entire ecosystem. When leaders speak with unwavering conviction, their tone, posture, and rhythm propagate through the social field, entraining others into similar patterns. Neurophysiologically, authority activates attachment-based compliance circuits. The brain often treats authority figures as regulatory anchors. When authority communicates certainty, followers experience physiological reassurance. This reassurance reinforces behavioral conformity even when individuals privately experience doubt. Dogmatism becomes institutionalized through hierarchical resonance. Emotional climate conditioning. Environmental grooming extends beyond language and authority into emotional climate. Some environments maintain high emotional intensity around ideological or organizational identity. Emotional amplification increases the moral heat mechanism described earlier in this episode. Within emotionally charged environments, dissent often triggers subtle relational withdrawal or overt confrontation. Individuals quickly learn that emotional safety depends on ideological alignment. The autonomic nervous system begins pairing certainty with emotional security. Over time, individuals regulate their own emotions by reinforcing group-approved belief structures. Emotional discomfort arising from doubt becomes resolved through ideological reinforcement. The environment trains members to self-regulate through certainty rather than reflection. Emotion becomes an adhesive binding identity to belief. Repetition and behavioral entrenchment. One of the most powerful mechanisms of environmental grooming is repetition. Behavior repeated within stable social contexts gradually becomes an embodied habit. Repetition strengthens neural pathways within basal ganglia circuits responsible for automated behavioral patterns. In certainty-driven environments, individuals repeatedly rehearse declarative communication, reduced gestural variability, controlled emotional expression, and ideological reaffirmation. Each repetition strengthens the somatic blueprint of dogmatism. Over time, these behaviors require less conscious effort. They become the individual's default interaction style across multiple contexts, even outside the original environment. The body and brain internalize the environment. Collective predictive stability groups, organized around rigid belief structures, generate powerful predictive stability. Members know what will be said, how it will be interpreted, and what emotional responses will follow. Predictability reduces social anxiety and increases group cohesion. From a neurophysiological perspective, collective predictive stability reduces individual cognitive load. When group narratives are fixed, individuals rely less on personal perceptual evaluation and more on collective interpretation. This transfer of perceptual responsibility creates psychological efficiency but reduces individual autonomy. The group becomes an externalized nervous system regulating members through shared certainty. Subtle punishment and reward cycles. Environmental grooming rarely relies on explicit coercion. Instead, it operates through subtle reward and punishment cycles. Agreement often produces micro-rewards such as social warmth, professional opportunity, or emotional validation. Disagreement may produce subtle withdrawal, delayed responses, or reputational ambiguity. These microsignals are powerful because they operate below conscious awareness. The nervous system tracks them as indicators of safety or threat. Individuals gradually shape behavior to maximize reward signals and minimize social friction. The body begins anticipating reward when certainty is expressed. Posture stabilizes. Breath aligns with group rhythm. Vocal tone mirrors collective authority. The organism becomes synchronized with environmental expectation. Case observation. The high-performance culture. Consider a high-performance organizational environment where efficiency, clarity, and rapid decision-making are prioritized. New members entering the system initially contribute diverse viewpoints. Over time, they observe that senior members communicate with unwavering decisiveness and minimal emotional variability. During meetings, individuals expressing nuanced or exploratory ideas experience subtle interruptions or redirection toward definitive conclusions. Those presenting firm, confident proposals receive praise and recognition. Over successive interactions, members unconsciously adjust their communication style to align with rewarded behaviors. Within months, meeting dynamics shift. Discussion becomes faster but narrower. Emotional expression becomes controlled. Members display similar postural rigidity, vocal cadence, and conversational pacing. The organization experiences increased operational efficiency but decreased perceptual diversity. Dogmatism emerges not through enforcement but through behavioral entrainment. Case observation. Ideological community reinforcement. In communities organized around a strong ideological identity, environmental grooming often manifests through ritualized language and emotional synchronization. Group gatherings emphasize shared narratives, moral clarity, and collective affirmation. Members expressing absolute certainty receive emotional reinforcement through applause, agreement, or elevated social status. Members introducing nuance may encounter subtle social cooling. Over time, individuals internalize group-approved expressions of certainty as markers of belonging. Their somatic patterns begin mirroring the collective emotional rhythm. Breath synchronizes with group vocal chanting or affirmation. Posture aligns with communal display of conviction. Identity becomes interwoven with group certainty. Individual perceptual flexibility decreases as collective emotional regulation increases. The environment becomes a resonance chamber amplifying ideological rigidity. The invisible nature of grooming. Environmental grooming is rarely recognized because it feels normal from within. Participants experience reinforcement as encouragement, clarity, or cultural tradition. Resistance often appears unnecessary or destabilizing. The grooming process succeeds precisely because it does not appear coercive. Individuals often interpret their increasing certainty as personal growth or intellectual refinement. They rarely recognize how environmental rhythm has shaped their somatic and cognitive patterns. The body absorbs environmental expectation gradually, replacing exploratory perception with stabilized conviction. Dogmatism thrives in environments where certainty feels like belonging and belonging feels like safety. Understanding environmental grooming is not about identifying external villains or condemning institutional structures. It is about recognizing how human nervous systems adapt to social reinforcement loops. Every environment shapes perception. Every system entrains a behavioral rhythm. The question is not whether grooming occurs, but how consciously individuals recognize its influence. In the next section, we'll explore the sovereign shield, a perceptual and somatic orientation allowing individuals to remain present within structured environments without surrendering cognitive and bodily flexibility. It will explore how individuals maintain internal reference while participating in collective systems. because sovereignty does not require withdrawal from environments. It requires awareness of how environments shape the body. Once awareness returns, certainty can soften without dissolving identity. Dogmatism loses its biological necessity when the organism learns to stabilize itself from within. The sovereign shield once individuals begin recognizing how certainty can harden through cognition, somatic architecture, and environmental reinforcement, a new vulnerability emerges. The vulnerability is not external pressure, it is internal disorientation. When long-held certainty softens, the nervous system often experiences temporary instability. Beliefs that previously anchored identity begin to loosen. Social mirrors that once confirmed belonging becomes less reliable. The organism, having relied on external certainty to regulate internal coherence, may experience a sensation similar to gravitational drift. This is the moment where many individuals instinctively seek replacement certainty. The sovereign shield exists to prevent that reflex. It is not a defensive barrier. It is an internal orientation that allows perception to remain fluid without dissolving identity. Sovereignty as internal reference. Sovereignty begins when identity is no longer anchored exclusively to belief structures or environmental validation. Instead, identity begins stabilizing through interoceptive awareness, the organism's capacity to sense internal physiological signals as reliable orientation markers. The brain typically relies on external feedback to regulate perception. Social agreement, authority endorsement, and ideological alignment provide predictive stability. When individuals begin releasing rigid certainty, these external anchors weaken. The nervous system must then learn to regulate using internal sensory data. Interoception becomes a navigational compass. Signals such as breathing depth, muscular tension, visceral sensation, vocal resonance, and postural microadjustment begin providing real-time feedback about relational and cognitive alignment. These signals allow individuals to detect when perception is narrowing into defensive certainty or expanding into receptive awareness. Sovereignty is the ability to remain oriented to these internal signals, even when external environments promote rigidity. The neurobiology of self-stabilization from a neurological perspective. The sovereign shield relies on strengthening communication between the anterior insular, prefrontal cortex, and ventral vagal complex. These networks collectively support self-awareness, emotional regulation, and social engagement flexibility. When individuals operate from external certainty, the brain often bypasses interoceptive processing in favor of predictive group models. Sovereign perception reverses this hierarchy. Internal sensory integration becomes primary. External information becomes secondary and evaluative rather than regulatory. This shift does not remove environmental influence. It simply prevents external signals from overriding bodily awareness. The organism learns to process social and ideological information without surrendering physiological self-regulation. The body becomes an internal lighthouse stabilizing perception within shifting relational seas. Flexibility without collapse. A common fear when releasing dogmatic certainty is the belief that flexibility will lead to identity collapse. The nervous system often associates openness with vulnerability and unpredictability. The sovereign shield reframes flexibility as dynamic stability rather than structural weakness. Dynamic stability resembles biological homeostasis. Living organisms maintain equilibrium not through rigidity but through continuous microadjustment. Muscles lengthen and contract. Breath expands and compresses. Neural networks recalibrate in response to changing stimuli. Sovereign cognition mirrors this biological rhythm. Beliefs become adaptive frameworks rather than fixed fortifications. Individuals retain conviction without requiring perceptual closure. Identity becomes capable of expansion without fragmentation. Certainty transforms from armor into navigation. The somatic signature of sovereignty. When individuals operate from sovereign perception, distinct somatic patterns emerge. These patterns contrast sharply with the muscular and autonomic architecture described in Section 5. Breathing typically deepens and regains variability. The diaphragm resumes full oscillation, allowing parasympathetic regulation to coexist with cognitive engagement. Muscular tension redistributes from chronic contraction toward responsive elasticity. The jaw softens. The cervical spine regains micromobility. Posture remains upright but fluid rather than locked. Vocal tone regains melodic contour. Speech cadence slows slightly, allowing reflective pauses without loss of authority. Facial microexpression increases in variability, enhancing relational attunement without compromising clarity of thought. The sovereign body does not abandon strength. It abandons rigidity. Strength becomes responsiveness. Linguistic markers of sovereign cognition. Sovereignty also reveals itself through language. Dogmatic speech often relies on absolute phrasing, declarative finality, and binary classification. Sovereign speech maintains clarity while incorporating perceptual openness. Common linguistic markers of sovereign cognition include conditional framing rather than absolute declaration, reflective phrasing allowing simultaneous conviction and curiosity, integration of uncertainty without surrendering perspective, statements such as, "This is how I currently understand it. This perspective feels stable to me, though I remain open to refinement. There may be complexity here I have not yet seen." These linguistic patterns do not weaken authority. They demonstrate cognitive elasticity. The nervous system communicates strength through adaptability rather than finality. Language becomes a living structure capable of growth. Environmental participation without absorption sovereignty does not require withdrawal from structured environments or ideological communities. Instead, it enables individuals to participate without unconscious somatic entrainment. The individual recognizes environmental rhythms while maintaining internal regulatory independence. Within hierarchical or certainty-driven systems, sovereign individuals often display subtle behavioral differences. They maintain relational presence without synchronizing fully with group rigidity. Their posture remains responsive rather than fixed. Their speech integrates clarity with reflective modulation. Their emotional responses remain authentic rather than environmentally prescribed. This positioning can initially feel socially ambiguous. The individual is present yet not fully absorbed. Over time, sovereign presence often stabilizes group dynamics by introducing perceptual elasticity into otherwise rigid ecosystems. Sovereignty becomes contagious in the same way dogmatism can be contagious. Both propagate through somatic mirroring and linguistic resonance. The tolerance of unresolved complexity, one of the defining characteristics of the sovereign shield, is tolerance for unresolved complexity. Dogmatic cognition resolves ambiguity quickly to preserve internal coherence. Sovereign cognition allows ambiguity to remain metabolically tolerable. Neuroscientifically, this reflects increased integration between prefrontal executive networks and limbic emotional processing. The brain becomes capable of holding multiple predictive models simultaneously without triggering defensive collapse. Emotionally, this tolerance allows individuals to experience uncertainty without compulsive certainty replacement. Socially, it permits engagement with diverse perspectives without identity fragmentation. Sovereignty is not the absence of conviction. It is a conviction that can coexist with complexity. The ethical dimension of sovereignty's sovereign perception introduces an ethical transformation. When individuals regulate themselves internally rather than through environmental reinforcement, they become less susceptible to coercive certainty systems. Their relational participation becomes choice-driven rather than fear-driven. Ethically, sovereignty reduces the probability of ideological aggression. Individuals grounded in internal regulation do not require external validation to maintain identity stability. They can encounter conflicting perspectives without perceiving them as existential threats. This does not eliminate disagreement. It transforms disagreement into perceptual dialogue rather than identity warfare. Sovereignty replaces ideological survival with relational exploration. The silent stability of the sovereign shield rarely announces itself. It does not appear dramatic or confrontational. It manifests a subtle behavioral steadiness. Individuals grounded in sovereignty often appear calm in ideologically charged environments. They listen without immediate reaction. They speak without compulsive certainty. They adjust posture and tone fluidly in response to relational cues. Their stability arises from internal sensory reference rather than environmental alignment. The nervous system no longer seeks certainty as its primary regulatory mechanism. Safety is generated through self-awareness, interoceptive tracking, and adaptive cognition. This stability allows individuals to encounter dogmatic environments without absorbing them. It allows engagement without assimilation. The sovereign shield does not dismantle dogmatism through confrontation. It dissolves its necessity through internal regulation. Once individuals stabilize identity through somatic awareness and flexible cognition, rigid certainty loses its biological utility. The closing phase of this episode will integrate cognitive, somatic, and environmental insights into a cohesive orientation. It will not prescribe belief change. It can help restore perceptual agency, allowing individuals to navigate certainty-driven systems without losing cognitive elasticity or relational authenticity. Because dogmatism is not defeated by opposing ideology, it is softened when the nervous system no longer requires certainty to feel safe. And safety, when generated from within, allows perception to remain open without dissolving identity. When certainty seeks companions, dogmatism rarely exists as a solitary phenomenon. Certainty, once stabilized within cognition and embodied through somatic architecture, begins searching for resonance. Human nervous systems are relational by design. Perception does not fully stabilize until it is mirrored by others. Belief, once hardened, seeks environments and relationships that reflect its structure to itself. Certainty becomes most powerful when it becomes collective. Throughout this episode, we have traced how belief transforms from adaptive cognitive stabilization into embodied rigidity. We have observed how muscular architecture, respiratory rhythm, vocal structure, and environmental reinforcement cooperate to sustain ideological solidity. We have explored how sovereignty emerges not through opposition, but through internal regulatory independence. Yet an additional layer remains. When certainty finds collective reinforcement, it evolves beyond individual perception. It becomes social gravity. Groups begin synchronizing not only beliefs, but emotional rhythms, behavioral patterns, and identity boundaries. Collective certainty produces amplified stability while simultaneously narrowing perceptual diversity. Communities organized around certainty often experience profound cohesion. Shared narratives create belonging. Unified emotional responses generate synchronized nervous system regulation. Members feel protected by shared clarity. The group becomes an external extension of the individual regulatory system, but collective certainty introduces new vulnerabilities. When identity becomes distributed across group alignment, individuals may experience separation from collective belief as an existential threat. The nervous system begins associating disagreement not only with cognitive instability, but with relational exile. The biological architecture of belonging intertwines with ideological uniformity. At this stage, dogmatism ceases to operate purely as belief maintenance. It begins functioning as identity protection through group synchronization. The next episode will explore this relational and collective dimension. We will examine how dogmatic structures expand through social bonding, moral alignment, and emotional contagion. It will investigate how communities can unconsciously amplify certainty through relational grooming, loyalty signaling, and ideological mirroring. We will also explore the biological and psychological mechanisms that make collective certainty feel sacred, protective, and resistant to perceptual flexibility. When belief becomes shared identity, disagreement begins to resemble betrayal. When disagreement resembles betrayal, perception becomes organized around loyalty rather than observation. Episode 3 will move into this territory carefully through examining the core word, instigation. We will not examine collective certainty as a failure of intelligence or morality. We will examine it as an extension of human relational neurobiology. We will explore how belonging, protection, and identity intertwine with ideological alignment, and how individuals can remain relationally connected without dissolving perceptual autonomy. Dogmatism grows stronger when it becomes collective. Sovereignty grows stronger when it remains relational without becoming absorbed. The next episode will stand at the intersection of those forces. If you have followed this episode closely, you may notice subtle shifts within your own perception. Perhaps you have recognized moments where certainty once felt stabilizing. Perhaps you have noticed how posture, breath, or tone subtly change when identity feels challenged. Perhaps you have recognized environments where clarity felt reassuring, yet quietly reduced curiosity. These observations are not accusations. They are invitations to awareness. Dogmatism is not a flaw in human cognition. It is an evolutionary adaptation designed to stabilize identity, preserve belonging, and reduce existential uncertainty. Every nervous system has the capacity to seek certainty when instability feels overwhelming. Recognizing this does not weaken identity. It expands compassion both toward others and toward oneself. Perception becomes sovereign not when certainty disappears, but when certainty loses its necessity as a regulatory anchor. Sovereignty allows conviction to remain present while permitting curiosity to remain alive. It allows identity to remain intact while allowing perception to remain fluid. It transforms belief from a fortress into a navigational instrument. You do not need to dismantle certainty to explore it. You do not need to abandon identity to expand it. You do not need to oppose dogmatism to understand its biological origins. Understanding alone often softens rigidity more effectively than confrontation. As you move forward with your day, notice moments when conviction feels stabilizing. Notice when your breath changes during disagreement. Notice how your body responds when environments reward certainty or discourage nuance. These signals are not instructions. They are orientation markers guiding perception back toward internal reference. You are not required to resolve every belief. You are not required to challenge every certainty. You are invited only to remain aware of how belief lives within cognition, body, and environment simultaneously. The resonance matrix exists not to replace certainty with uncertainty, but to reveal how perception moves through living systems, linguistic, somatic, relational, and environmental. Until next time, remain observant of how certainty feels in your body. Remain curious about how language shapes perception before meaning forms. Remain patient with the rhythms of identity as they expand and contract through experience. Perception is not static, identity is not fixed, and awareness once awakened rarely requires force to continue growing. Thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to see it, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to the Resonance Matrix Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode. I'm James Miller.